Starting off today with a swim before we talk about balancing the exposure triangle. That was a good swim, but I really didn't think that it'd be really cold here in Tuscany, and I really underestimated it. I was wearing shorts yesterday and I was freezing. But anyway, today we're going to be talking about the exposure triangle and balancing the different parts of it. So if you want to go back and watch the episodes about the different parts of the exposure triangle, I'm gonna stop you right here. You can pause and watch it first and then watch this. Alright, now that you're here and you've watched those videos, let's do a short recap. Alright, so recap. Shutter speed controls how long the sensor is exposed to light, and it also controls how much motion blur there is in the photo. Aperture controls how wide the opening of the lens is, which means it controls how much light goes through the lens. It also controls how wide or how narrow the depth of field is. And lastly, ISO controls how sensitive the sensor is to light, and it also controls how much noise or grain there is in the photo. Now that we're done with that quick recap, let's talk about balancing the exposure triangle. Triangle. We are creatures of habit, and we are now back at the same restaurant we went to last night. It's really good, so we're gonna have more pasta, and I am stoked. Then after that, we're gonna head over to Siena, and we're gonna see what that city has to offer. We have arrived at Siena and it's just amazing. It's super steep to get up here, so there are like 5 escalators. Now we're inside the walled city of Siena and it just feels so secure because like all the tall buildings and the walls and everything. It's very nice actually. Okay, so balancing the exposure triangle. The basic idea is you have to pick 1 or 2 that are important to you or important to how you want the photo to look like, and then compensate with the rest. So depending on what you want the photo to look like with the lighting conditions, then you're gonna use one or the other to compensate. The end goal would be to arrive at a proper exposure. Now, a proper exposure doesn't mean exactly what your metering sensor would tell you. It could be overexposed or underexposed, depending on how you want your photo to look like before you edit it. So use the exposure triangle, pick what you want, and be creative about it. Now check out this Duomo. It's quite nice. Alright, so here are some of my tips for setting your exposure triangle and just a guideline for good settings to use for each situation. Right, so let's start with portraiture. So when I shoot portraiture, I usually open up the aperture to its widest so that I can get that really creamy background blur and bokeh that I really enjoy using in my portraits. Next, the shutter speed, I usually put it at 1/125th of a second because it's something that I can handhold and I feel like it's exactly enough that it freezes motion when shooting portraits and also is enough light. And lastly, the ISO, that's what I use to compensate. So usually I lower my ISO or increase my ISO depending on whether or not I want to underexpose or overexpose for the image. If you're doing landscapes, my tip would be to focus on aperture and ISO. For landscapes, you'd want to use a really small aperture so you have a larger depth of field, so more things would be in focus because you'd want to see all the details between the foreground, the background, and maybe the subject if there is. The next thing you'd want to prioritize is your ISO. Keeping your ISO at a low value for landscapes is important so that you could bring back shadow details in the parts that become underexposed, and you can also bring back highlight details in the parts that become overexposed. And lastly, what you use to compensate would be the shutter speed. Usually for landscape photography, people like to use tripods so they can slow down their shutter speed to something like 1/10, 1/5, or even do a long exposure to see like the clouds moving or the waves crashing in. For sports photography, you'd want to focus on your shutter speed because you want to be able to freeze the motion and really get that moment. Another thing you might want to focus on is your aperture, so you can get everything in focus, especially because in sports, the subject could move forwards and backwards really quickly. And lastly, I recommend you use ISO to compensate, so you can really increase your shutter speed to capture that motion. And lastly, for street photography, this one can be very different for each person, but what I usually do is I set my aperture at its widest to get a really nice shallow depth of field, because for street photography, I really like it when it feels like a portrait of someone, but it's really candid. And another thing I like to focus on is the shutter speed to really capture that motion, just like in sports photography. And then use the ISO to compensate, because sometimes if there's enough noise, you can turn the photo black and white and it looks even nicer.
For all time's sake. As time goes by.
Alright, it's dinner time and we're getting pizza and pasta and burgers and all that good stuff. At the end of the day, my final tip would just be to go with what works for you. Do what you like and go for what makes a photo that you like. Some people like everything in focus, and that's fine. And other people really like a lot of bokeh. Some people prefer their photos clean and without any noise, and other people like to use the grain artistically. At the end of the day, it's up to you, and just have fun with it. Do what you enjoy and what makes a good photo in your eyes. That's it for today. See you guys tomorrow.